take for you to start moving forward? Today's guest is Derek Teel. He is a former downhill pro rider and the founder of Dialed Health Strength Training for Cyclists. His mission is to help people tap into their strength and become stronger cyclists and humans, both on and off the bike. Earlier this year, he was involved in a really traumatic hit and run, which has really tested his application personally of this motto and this philosophy. I invited him to join the podcast and to share his journey of how strength, nutrition, cycling, and faith has helped him to start and continue moving forward after a major setback.
I can't believe you live in Mallorca, because that is literally my number one dream riding destination. Like, if I were to pick one spot right now that I've never been, that would be it.
Oh, really? Why is that? So, so you've never been here before?
Never been. No, I actually just did my first trip to Europe this summer. Funny enough.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah, we did Switzerland and Italy, and I rode a Fondo in Switzerland, which was incredible and eye-opening, but it just makes you want to travel more. And just from the cyclists I've talked to and the little research I've done, Mallorca seems like this place to go with a road bike.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'd visited a couple of times when I was living in Girona, and I thought that I'd get claustrophobic on the island, but since I've moved here, I've realized it is actually massive. There's so much to explore, and there's so much varieties. Where I found Girona is more just purely just cycling. I like so many other things as well. We're here. I found a really cool blend and a really cool mix of things. It's really cool to meet and to link up, and especially like having the faith angle is really cool as well, because there's a couple other Christian athletes that I've sort of got lined up to chat with over the next couple of months or so. It's interesting, one of those things that you discover, like you meet one and then you meet another and then you meet another, and it's easy to think that you're alone, you're the only one out there, and then you realize like, oh, there's actually lots of people out there, and a lot of people that want to share their faith, but not really necessarily knowing how to sort of share it.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say you feel isolated until you start talking to more Christians through social media or the cycling industry. It took a while for me to share my faith organically, almost because it became such a deep part of my life that it's like I couldn't not talk about just going to church with my family over the weekend, or a new set of values I have, or things I'm working towards, or things I'm working away from. And as I started sharing that, I did realize how many Christians there are that don't speak about their faith. I think for a few reasons. I think some people are afraid to talk about it and rub anyone the wrong way. But I also think there's a lot of people who are on social media for fun and for pretty lighthearted connection, or some specific information or entertainment, and there's no real need for them to go out and create this content about their faith, which I also totally understand. So I think some people might shy away from it, and I think for some people it just doesn't really come up. But as it does, it makes me realize how many more Christian athletes there are, Christians in the cycling industry, and just believers that are into sports and performance. Yeah. And so it makes you, I don't want to say want to be more forward than you are now, because I think you do just need to be genuine and organic. You don't need to lead with, like, for me, everything I do is through Dialed Health, which is my business. My business is strength training for cyclists. And so it almost doesn't make sense for me to lead with something about my faith in any content that I make. But having a podcast and doing long form content, like I said, it gets to the point where it's impossible not to talk about. And when you realize how many people resonate with it, you do get more confident in sharing it. And that is something that I think continually improves, is just that confidence and not feeling the need to have disclaimers behind things that you say or do, just because, it's easy to think about all the reactions that you get. So
because I think a lot of time we can get caught up in like, oh, people aren't going to like me, or they're going to unfollow, or we get caught in that fear or that scarcity sort of thing. But I mean, my experience has been more like when you start sharing your faith and your beliefs and your values, some people are like, oh, cool, me too. And other people are like, nah, whatever, I don't care. And it's a very small minority who maybe get offended or who are turned off by it. Whereas most people, I think it's more of a like, okay, that's cool for you, not for me, but like you do you kind of sort of thought.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is a small minority that'd be really turned off. They do seem to be the loudest, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I suppose it's that small minority of people, like in any area, that like to prove a point or want their voice to
Hmm.
be heard, or like are really extremist in their beliefs or their values or their opinions. So yeah, that translates to whether it's faith, it's strength, whether it's like nutrition or any sort of thing. I think it's
It's true.
interesting to sort of then link back to like your business and strength. And I mean, I'd followed you for a while, and it was just
Oh, great.
really cool. I think that having seen like I think it was that post that you put up about sort of faith and a bubble burst. And I'm like, oh, I relate to you, like as a human, as a person beyond the health on a personal sort of level. And I thought that was really cool. Can't remember what verse it was.
Oh yeah. Well, shoot, I can't remember off the top of my head either, but I have been talking about how my faith's helped me through my injury this year. That's
Yeah,
one thing that, again, it just feels like it's unavoidable to talk about because
yeah,
I obviously can't
and you,
imagine going through this without God.
yeah, and like a life and your death sort of experience. So like, do you want to? Yeah, I guess it's a good place to sort of start and talk back to because it was early January or mid January when it happened, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it was actually January 31st, funny enough. So last day of
Oh,
January, and just out on a normal zone 2 road ride, local roads, middle of the day, kind of just fitting it in between work. And I went through a four-way stop sign and was making a left turn. And one thing I'm very honest about is the fact that I did not stop. I did slow up and, look left, look center, look right. By the time I'm looking left again, this car, which I had seen that was very far away, was now just inches from hitting me. And we came to find out later that this car was driving about 60 miles an hour, country roads, comes around a corner, undulations. I saw him and expect what I expected to see when I first saw that there was a car coming was, by the time I get to the intersection, this car is going to be slowing down into a stop. Probably not even there yet, but they were going so much faster than what they should have been doing. And
yeah,
because as a cyclist, you go through millions of stop signs, stop lights, intersections, and you kind of expect a car to do something close to what they should do, at least. And it was so wildly different than that it still caught me off guard. And thankfully, it was a small car. I was able to jump before the impact. And I think ultimately that saved my life was that last second jump because everything that was hit was basically from my waist down. Thankfully, my spine was okay. Thankfully, my head was okay. I just blacked out briefly. And it was just the rest of my body that was really beat up. So ended up basically laying on the ground with an open pelvis fracture, holding my pelvis in my hand, lots of blood loss, which was the big concern for my life in the immediate. Broken femur, broken tibia, fibula, torn colon, collapsed lung, lots of things that were connected, very bad. And thankfully, I was, I feel like saved by God. You know, there's this big question of always like, why does God let bad things happen?
yeah,
And it's interesting because I've never been challenged so much to have faith through such a difficult time. And I still don't know the answer to that as far as whether or not this was planned to happen for me. But I know that regardless, God can take any bad thing and make it good.
yeah,
And that's almost what I feel like has happened from this situation is that this horrible thing happened to me and immediately God responded
yeah,
because the roads I was on are quiet roads. They're country wine roads. And it's kind of the places we go to escape cars. And so the intersection I was hit on, it's very common for a car to not come through for 5 minutes,
yeah,
maybe 10. I mean, just
yeah,
quiet intersections. And I had people who were not only eyewitnesses, which was great because the driver stopped, looked at me, got back in the car, and left. Uh, yeah, and they caught him, and we had a crazy sort of reconciliation. We went to his sentencing, and he asked for forgiveness for my family, like to my wife's
yeah,
face, to my parents' face. It was
yeah,
it was really I was grateful for that. There's a lot of closure there.
yeah.
Obviously, it doesn't change what happened, but I think moving forward, there's a lot of peace, which is very nice. And just getting the opportunity to tell that person that you forgive them,
I suppose
because
it gives you you end up as like that weight off your shoulders and release.
Yeah, I can't imagine it going a different direction, and just building up this vengeance would just be, it would just overpower you, and it'd probably direct a lot of your life. So I was grateful to have that opportunity. And like I said, I should not have had people around, but I not only had eyewitnesses to it, I had people on scene within 30 seconds. And then I had an off duty registered nurse within a minute and a half of being hit. And she was the one who I really believe saved my life, because what I remember was watching her walk up, take her sweatshirt off, and then I just feel her stuffing it into my side. And
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was
Like,
just to stop the blood loss. And so without that, I don't know what would have happened. But it was a long, painful ambulance trip to the hospital, and a very long, painful road to recovery. I'm just over 8 months now, and thankfully riding again, strength training. I have had some complications along the way, and I might have to get a little bit of hardware removed. But all in all, the recovery is going great considering what happened, and I'm working towards getting fit again. And I'll probably be feeling the accident for the rest of my life, but some major things that could have prevented me from really getting back on the bike in the first place were, didn't happen. For instance, I broke my pelvis and my femur very badly, but my hip socket and my hip joint were completely unharmed. And
yeah.
a lot of my tendons and ligaments were actually in still very good shape. So it was mostly bones, and then some organs that were damaged. And the organs are very serious, especially a colon tear. But thankfully, it wasn't all the way through, and that was able to heal up. And so, yeah, it's strange to look back at something so extreme and
Yeah.
to see good coming from it. But I'm already starting to see that happen. Which is encouraging.
Being able to take the silver lining out of the bad things that happen, because I think a lot of people can relate to, I mean, perhaps not to being hit by a car, but everyone's had something bad happen to them in some case of life, and being able to see that good can come from it and being able to move from it and let go of the past is such a very freeing, to not get stuck and fester and get caught in blame. Having that story determine the rest of your life, because have you found that as a result the way you work or your practice or your lifestyle has changed much in response to that?
Well, it's given me plenty of time to think, and I'll kind of go into how my day to day has changed since then. But along the lines of not getting stuck somewhere you're not supposed to be, I just came across this piece of content. It was a pastor talking about it, and it was so incredible. And he was just basically saying that, God didn't. There's some seasons that come up in life that God just wanted us to experience once,
Yeah.
and not experience and relive every day for the rest of our life. And that's what trauma can do for you. I've been grateful to go through some. I did some EMDR therapy, which is trauma specific therapy, and incredibly helpful. It's like it completely reframed the experience, but not in a false way either. It just gives you a bigger picture, and you're able to get a bit broader understanding of what happened and kind of remove yourself from that fear.
Yeah.
And not sitting in that fear has been the hardest thing. In fact, I've realized that even during worship, I've almost been worshiping more out of fear than out of joy this entire year. And it wasn't until recently till I've kind of realized that. And so it's crazy how one thing could happen. I mean, this split second instance could really reshape the rest of your life. And if it wasn't for my faith and having pastors and Christian trauma therapists and a healthy family and all these this foundation of habits and just an environment of love that I'm in 24, well, mostly most of my life, I can't, I could see how this would go on to affect you or change you for the rest of your life. And so I'm very grateful for that awareness, and even these reminders that sometimes you're meant to experience something just once, and not, don't get stuck somewhere that, God was trying to push you through. Actually, Christine Kane, Australian pastor, who, I'm assuming just because you're Australian. She's
Yeah,
one
I
of my
think
favorite.
I'm reading one of her books at the moment, or like a daily devotion book that great books.
Oh, that's
She's a great
awesome.
writer.
Yeah, her podcast is amazing too. She talks about that too, just not getting stuck and not letting this one thing shape the rest of your life. And so, that's been that like on the forefront of my mind, because, to be honest, before this, I was kind of feeling like on top of the world, from
Yeah,
family to business to opportunities. The momentum that I had this January was unlike, and the success I was experiencing was definitely unlike anything I had up to that point, and also further than I really had expected I would go.
yeah,
And so it was tough to come from that to a low point where I'm kind of questioning everything I'm doing. And really, a lot of the success I've had is by using my physical body, which I cannot do now. At that time, I couldn't do it. And I knew it'd be
yeah.
a while before I could. It's actually been longer to get back than I expected, even though my doctors have said that I'm doing awesome,
But it's like we're all
well beyond their
superhuman, and like
expectations.
you say 6 weeks, like it's going to be 2 weeks. Like my body is superhuman. We always want it to be
I
faster and better. And
so guilty of thinking that way. I'm always, every injury, I've torn ACLs and had other broken bones, and big injuries that are just a lot more minor than what I went through. And it's like, okay, whatever you say, subtract 30%. That's me. I'm good.
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
it's so guilty of thinking that way.
I'm interested to hear about the EMDR, like
EMDR.
EMDR, the eye rapid movement thing, because it's something I've invested in a bit more recently to treat some ongoing stuff that happened to me about 10 years ago that's been triggering me more recently. And I tried it once, and then it's because it brought up all that emotion. I was like, oh, I don't like this. I don't like going back into it. And I sort of parked it for a while. Like I'm curious to hear like how long or how often you were using that as a tool to sort of help you move from the active trauma affecting you and that fear.
Yeah, great question. I know exactly what you mean. Going in for an EMDR session is really scary because the whole point is that you're going to relive the most
Yeah.
traumatic thing that's ever happened to you. And
Mm.
so that's not very appealing. I think one thing that was important for me was following up and doing another session,
Mm.
because doing that made me realize how much of the trauma I had taken care of in the first session
Yeah.
by going back to it that second time. And then it allowed me to go to some other places that I really didn't think I would go. And so that were completely unrelated, and
Mm.
they were smaller, but they were still there. And then I had initial consultation. I had 2 sessions of EMDR. I went back for a third session. And before we even started, I think we both knew that I didn't need it at that
Yeah.
time. And
Interesting.
there's a chance I could go back again, but doing the follow-ups was really good because it it almost showed me how much I had worked through, even though it just felt difficult the first time and very emotional and exhausting. I mean,
Yeah.
the my session was 90 minutes, and honestly, if you would have told me it was during the time,
Yeah.
my eyes were closed and you're holding these vibrating pucks in your hand, and the whole point of these pucks is to basically interrupt the connection. And I could be butchering this, but to my understanding, when you relive the process, you have all these thoughts and feelings that are attached to each other. So you have these memories and you have these feelings, and then this memory provokes this feeling. Well, the back and forth vibration of the pucks apparently disrupts that thought process, and it disrupts whatever's going on in your brain so that
Yeah.
it can reframe it and stick better than if you weren't using them. And it stands
Mm.
for, I think, eye movement desensitization. I have such a hard time saying this
Yeah.
word.
It's like, yeah, eye
Desensitization.
movement. Yeah. It's like the rapid eye
Desensitization.
desensitization. Is that
Yes.
it?
Yeah, yes. I basically was laying there, eyes closed. It was a 90-minute session, but really, if you told me it was 15 minutes or you told me it was 2 hours, that was the craziest thing when it was done.
Yeah.
My perception of time was completely gone. And I think that's how I knew that I was into it. And it wasn't until we finished and I was like, oh my gosh. I think I had asked her, I said, was that like 30 minutes or something? She's like, no, that was 90. And
Yeah.
it blew me away. So that was really powerful. And the follow ups were powerful. And to give you kind of basically a recap of what I experienced, I went from the moment where I was hit and I have a very good memory of it because this is like the best and worst side of it. You know, I obviously didn't have any brain trauma, which is I'm very grateful for. Downside is that I remember everything. I felt everything
Yeah.
in real time. I could think clearly, as clearly as
Yeah.
I could. I was
Yeah.
borderline going into shock for a second, but it's like I knew what was going on, and
Yeah.
the way the fear set in that moment, I think was different than someone who might have just been concussed throughout the experience. And so, you know, it's almost like a joke with action sports athletes. Like I grew up racing downhill mountain bikes and skateboarding and friends in motocross. And you almost joke about having a little bit of a concussion when you do break your
Yeah.
leg or you break your arm because you didn't feel the pain the way that you would have. And so that I almost think made the trauma a little bit more extreme
Yeah.
because it was so real. I mean, it was just, I was completely coherent. And so when I did the first session at EMDR, I went back to that moment where I was laying on the ground, and it was before the ambulance came and I had three people around me. And yeah, I just felt like I was bleeding to death. And so in that first session, I went back to it in first person, the way I really remember it.
Yeah.
And then during the session, you start going in talking about what's happening, and you move through it. And I moved through it pretty chronologically about what I would feel. And then as soon as I would start to get off track, my counselor would bring me back into the moment. And so we would almost like reset. It's like, okay, where are you now? And every single time we did that reset, I went from first person to third person. And then I went to the point where it just started zooming out. And I literally, sorry, I get a little emotional thinking about it, but it's crazy. I got to the point by the end of it where it's like I was almost in a little snow globe, and I was actually holding the snow globe in my hand, in my two hands, and all I could see were my two hands and me on the pavement with these people around me in the setting at the intersection. But it was so far away I could almost barely see it. And what's crazy was every time it zoomed out, my perception of what happened changed. It went
Mm.
from pure fear
Yeah.
to more so curiosity. And
Mm.
that was the first session. I was like, wow, like I feel different. I literally
Yeah.
feel less afraid, but I feel more curious. And it
Yeah.
took a while to figure out why I felt curious.
Yeah.
And after some back and forth, I think the curiosity really comes from what's God going to do with this? This
Yeah.
was so extreme. It was so bad, but the way I was saved was miraculous. And so it makes me it's weird to say something like this. It makes me feel like God
Yeah.
really wants me here. But also, as I say that, I understand there are people with tragic deaths all the time. So
Yeah.
it's not like I'm implying that God doesn't want them there.
Mm.
And this is, I think, the understanding we have as humans. Like we know our own little world, but it really made me feel like God wants me here, and I'm like, okay, what's God going to do with this? What's the rest of my life look like for me to be saved this way? You know?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really cool like observation to have come to, and the fact that you can disconnect and not be then caught up in that trauma and be able to leave it in the past and move on with your life and reset is like, okay, what am I doing? Where am I going? What am I trying to achieve? All those sorts of things. I think they're such valuable questions for all of us to be thinking about and exploring. I journal most days and I write, and that's usually how I figure out what's going on in my head, and I forget
Mm,
until I write it down, and I'm like, oh yeah, I keep wanting to do this and getting clear on my vision and my goals and my values and all that. But it's so easy to get distracted and caught up in just everyday life.
mm-hmm.
Did you notice with getting back into cycling and then racing, because you did that the ultra, the Everesting, what was it, ICU to Everest? That was the goal of the project this that you were training for, to rebuild back into this
Yeah.
year. How was that getting back on the bike?
Oh, it's frustrating. You know, I have always set pretty audacious riding goals. In the last 4 years, I've done
Yeah,
some form of an Everesting challenge on my bike. So, uh, for anyone not, or for anyone listening that doesn't know what an Everest ride is, essentially you climb the equivalent vertical feet of Mount Everest 29,032 vertical feet. And it's a lot of climbing. If you don't ride, I guess you wouldn't know. If you've never ridden maybe 100 miles or gone out to specifically climb a certain mount, you may not understand. But to give someone perspective, I live in the foothills, so rolling terrain, and I could go for a 40-mile ride and maybe climb 2,000 feet. And if I go out of my way, I'll climb 3,500 feet. But to climb 29,000, it really is a lot. And so I've done it on a mountain bike and on a road bike. I actually did a double Everest where I climbed 58,000 feet in one ride. So it took 20.
Do you like climbing, or are you just a sucker for punishment?
I think a little bit of both, to be honest.
Yeah.
I do. I got into climbing, I think, when I moved toward the endurance side of the sport, because climbing means you get to descend. And I really, what I really loved on the road bike was descending when I started. Yeah. And so I think that's why I do prefer climbs, because you also get the descent along with it, which is a lot of fun. And it's the terrain. Yeah, exactly. It's the views. Yeah. It's the in and out of canyons and climbing mountains. It's amazing. So I have set goals like that. I did an Everest Rome where you couldn't repeat the same climb, because a traditional Everest would essentially have you go up and down the same hill until you've climbed that vertical equivalent of Mount Everest. So there's all these variations and ways to do it. And every year I've set a big goal. And I was planning on doing something of that nature this year. But once the accident happened, I was like, gosh, I don't know if it's in the cards. And after about a month, I started feeling like, okay, I really want a goal to work towards and something to focus on. And I actually had thought of the ICU to Everest name before I really committed to it. And so when I said it, I was like, considering what I've done in the past 4 or 5 years, I can't imagine a better rebound, or it's just something that was more clear that I'm back and that I actually have gotten to the point where I've recovered and my fitness is back, that I can go and do this Everest thing, which I've been doing. And so I put my sights on an event, the Tour de Stations in Switzerland, which has an Everesting as one of their fondos. It's incredible. And I started training for it. I did a gravel race that actually went pretty dang well. It was 100 miles. And this was like 6 months after the injury. To be honest, for perspective, I'm still limping at this point when I walk. But when I ride, my pedal stroke was decent enough to where I could ride. I just didn't have much power, much stability. And basically, I signed up for the Everest ride, got within a month, and I was like, okay, I'm going to start training for this thing the best I can and give it the best shot. Even though when I compare what I've been doing this entire year compared to previous years, it's just not even close to the same type of fitness or preparation. So I started training for a month, and I think I got into the second week, and I just knew. I just was like, this is actually too much for my body. Could I physically be out there for a day while I do this? Possibly, but to be honest, I've also haven't pushed myself to that point since this injury. I have a lot of hardware in my body. Muscles still aren't working correctly. I still have an open wound on part of my surgical scar because of the hardware, and that's kind of a long story, but it's essentially rubbing a hole through my skin. And so there's a lot of variables that I've never dealt with before. So I definitely don't feel invincible like I have in the past. And I also need to ask myself, why am I doing this? Am I doing this for other people? Am I doing it for the sake of the story? Or is this for my actual recovery? And I realized, I was like, it's kind of for the sake of the story. And it was as much for me as for other people. But the reality was, I know that I don't quit. And if I put myself in that position, I was worried I would hurt myself instead of quitting. So what I did when it came time for the event was backed off the total climbing. So the project we've been filming this documentary for all year has been ICU to Everest, but essentially it's going to be part one. And I knew that. I was like, okay, you know what? It's not going to happen this year, and that's okay. Or it's not going to happen at this event, but I'm going to still go out there. I have this whole trip to Europe planned. It's my first trip. Like I said, my wife's coming, my videographer and his wife.
Yeah.
This is a dream riding trip. It's kind of like a bucket list thing for me to be riding in Switzerland to do this event. I'm commit. We're going. You know what I mean? So it got to that point. I was like, we're doing this thing, and then I backed off to their lower distance, but I got the meters and the vertical feet mixed up. I thought it'd be a ride with about 12,000 vertical feet of climbing. And for context, the most climbing I've done in one ride all year leading up to this, well, actually post accident leading up to it, was like 4,000 feet or 5,000 feet of climbing.
Yeah.
And the thing about climbing is that, you know, you think, oh, what's another 4,000? What's another 5,000? After you've already done that amount of climbing, it gets exponentially harder.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I learned in the double Everest. It's like you can get within, you know, I thought the home stretch was be the last 8,000, but that was the most brutal 8,000 feet I've ever climbed in my life.
I'm not naturally a climber, but what I find for it so frustrating. I did a ride on the weekend last week. It was like 180 Ks and 1,500 meters of climbing. I don't know what that is in feet. And climbing wise, I've just got nothing left after that climbing. But then I could get it back on the flat and go 35 kilometers an hour, no worries, in a headwind. And I'm like, what is going on? Like my muscles aren't working here. This is so frustrating. And you got muscles that are working in one place and not in another.
It's true. It's actually amazing how just the pressure of the pedal stroke changes whether you're climbing or on flats or descending and pedaling, and how much of a difference that really does make. And I think with all the strength training background that I have and how much of a priority that is in my life, it does lend itself to the more push. I don't want to say more push part of the pedal stroke, but I've felt confident being able to really just push on the pedals on a climb for a long period of time. It almost feels like doing a step up, you know, or a lunge or something like that. So basically I went to a shorter distance on this ride and got the meters mixed up. It was 4,800 meters. And I was like, oh, that's like 12,000 feet. Well, it turns out it was 16,000 feet. And so I roll out, I'm jet lagged. The night before I slept 1 hour just purely because of stress of the ride and being jet lagged. You know, a few days before, only got 2 hours of sleep on the plane. It's been a tight travel schedule. We've been riding each day. It has just been the furthest thing from a relaxing vacation or even just like a focused riding vacation. We're filming this documentary. I'm spending time with my wife. It was just a lot. And so by the time it came into the event day, it was the night before. I loaded up on my Garmin and see that it was 16,000 feet instead of 12,000. And I almost cracked. I was like, this is still so much bigger than I've done all year. And I can tell my fitness is not where it's at. My leg, I had some muscle compensation issues. So pushing on the pedals, it just didn't feel stable. There's no power. And I'm on these steep gradients, grinding at like a 75 cadence for hours. And I finished that ride. And I also probably should have stopped sooner. And that was when I really did realize, I was like, okay, I probably won't quit if I put myself in a situation like this.
Yeah.
And I was just very grateful that I didn't try and do more. But it's weird because it's like I needed to overdo it that far to get more confident not overdoing it. So like since I came home from that ride, my ability to train smart has been increased so much, whether it's my strength workouts, my rides, because I know I have it in me to go as hard as I'm capable of going. And I also know that when you go too hard, it just messes things up. And so it's like I had to go so far over that. And to be honest, I don't think anyone could have told me differently. And this is just a personal thing I've dealt with where even with business, I've had people say, hey, I don't know if I would go down this route because this is where it leads. And I'm like, no, I think it's going to be different for me. Okay. Like, but I'm going to have it figured out by the time I get there.
Like, this is the only way. Like, I know I'm not supposed to do it this way, but like, I can't do it any other way. I have to do it this way.
Yeah, it's got to be this way. And so in a lot of ways it served me. And in a lot of ways I've realized I'm like, wow, I really had to figure that out the hard way for myself. And that's essentially what that ride just ended up being. But since then, I have a way better understanding of what my fitness level is now. Cause that's also a thing that it's like you question, you're like, oh man, for a while I felt like a fit body with an injured leg where my body can do so much, but my leg just can't do it. My left side can't do it. And now I've gotten to a point where I think my fitness and my leg have almost caught up with each other. So it's a little bit
Okay.
more easier to read. I have a better understanding of what I can and can't do. And now I feel like I'm actually making a lot of progress because I'm still training hard, but not too hard.
Yeah.
And that feels really good. And I feel confident about that in the process. So it's just funny
Yeah.
how that kind of thing works. But, some
Yeah.
people just have to find out the hard way.
Yeah, it's like having it, finding your limits, and then learning the internal limits, plus also having the people around you that can be like, hang on, wait, you need to step back. You need to like tone this down. And it's like that twofold thing, as you say, of like figuring out like, okay, you're kind of scared to push it sometimes because you're like, oh, what if I overdo it here? And finding those limits. But it's also not even, I think sometimes when we stop, we have a goal and we don't achieve it and we fall short of it for whatever reason. It's so easy to get caught up and think that we've failed, but we haven't failed because, as you said, you haven't done anything like that since the accident and you don't know what your body's capable of. So maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but the only way you find out is actually going and doing it. As you said, you probably push yourself further than you would have previously even thought possible if you'd actually realized how big a project you signed up for.
Yeah. Yeah. Very well said. And, it's funny because one of those people that was just telling me like, dude, what are you doing? It was my dad. So he's been with me for every major ride project I've done. And I've definitely put him through some stress, which I've apologized for later. I mean, even the road that I double Everested on was
Yeah.
very, very sketchy. Cliffside, no lampposts, huge high speeds. I hit 50 miles an hour almost every descent, all through the middle of the night. And
Yeah.
he's just out there supporting me, but also terrified at the same time. And
Yeah.
knowing I have 3 little kids, and he has a better perspective than I do. So he's been with me on these rides, and he just was like, dude, just recover
Yeah.
gracefully. Don't grind through this. Why? He's like, you have nothing to prove. In fact, the last ride challenge I did was this Everest Rome ride, and it was like 326 miles, just through the middle of the night in the mountains in Lake Tahoe, just all the way back to the Sacramento Valley where I live. And I got done, and he just looked at me. He's like, dude, you have nothing to prove anymore. He's like,
Yeah.
stop doing this. he's like,
Yeah.
he's like, I will be there to support you, but like, stop. And so it was
Yeah.
funny because I understand where he's coming from now, but I still, even after the injury, had to do that
Yeah.
little push. So
That's
weird.
it, because it's coming, that driver is coming from within. It's that internal. I think with motivation, there's so many, like we have our external motivation and we have our internal motivation. And sometimes we need a combination of the two to help us push forward and to start moving forward. Is that your motto
Yeah, my
for your
motto.
business as well? Your motto is like start moving forward. And there's lots of things that can help people move forward, like strength training. I enjoy it when I'm doing it, but for the first few months, like I need someone kicking my butt to make me do it until I start enjoying it personally and then want to continue doing it. Once I get to that point, I can continue with the internal motivation, but it's figuring out what actually does drive us and how to hack that to move forward.
That's so true. Strength training is a great example of that. And it's almost like dieting. If you're doing an intentional calorie deficit because you want to lose weight, maybe you want to lose
Yeah.
body fat specifically, whatever your goals are, it there's a form of pain that comes along with it, and
Yeah.
there's ways to do it that are, uh, I think, more lasting than others. There's actually a word I'm looking for that's totally slipping my mind right now, but essentially, you know, you have to almost get the results to get remotivated as you go through the process. If you
Yeah.
dieted for, or let's just say you ate in a calorie deficit for 90 days, which is a very long time to actually do it,
Yeah.
and you were going to just lose all of the body fat or do everything on the very last day, like it all happened at once, it would be so much harder than the reality of slowly
Yeah.
seeing progress throughout it. And
Yeah.
sometimes even having someone there to remind you what your real progress is good too, because
Yeah.
day to day, sometimes it can feel insignificant from your perspective. So whether that's with
Oh, for
body fat
sure.
loss or strength training goals, a lot of people, I think with strength training in particular, it's 2 weeks of consistent strength training before they start to feel a little bit of that motivation, because the first couple of weeks you're going to retain a little water, you're going to feel crazy sore, and it's until your body starts to adapt. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like 4 days. I'm like, why is my butt like sitting down? It's like, ow. Like, I don't like walking up the stairs. I'm on the 4th floor of my apartment. There's no lift. So like, he's like, oh, you get home from a bike ride and you're like, oh my goodness, how am I going to get my bike up the stairs? How am I going to get up the stairs? And then he's kind of like, have to like, all right, juggle, like, how am I going to get the strength in so that it doesn't compromise the cycling that I want to do? And like, oh, I don't know.
Do you want to go in on that? Because that's like my whole job. Is figuring that out.
Yeah, why not? Like, fix me.
Let's do it. Okay, so the biggest way to balance it is to, it sounds like a weird strategy, but almost start with the bare minimum. So I came from the downhill gravity side of mountain biking and got into personal training full time, kind of left racing in the past, plan on moving on and not revisiting it. And so I went full general fitness industry. So this is strength training 3-4 days a week minimum. This is the lifestyle, minimal cardio, kind of the opposite of what we do as endurance athletes. And then trail riding came along, and this was about 2014. And I felt like I had a lot of unfinished business with riding. So I got a trail bike, and I was like, I'm going to give this enduro racing thing a shot. This seems like it's getting really cool. There's momentum behind it, which there was. And so I started continuing my strength training 3 to 4 days a week, mostly total body, but a lot of legs. Like I loved training legs in the gym. And I think it's from cycling, from just the enjoyment I get out of suffering.
Yeah.
And, suffering by choice, essentially. So I would train a lot of legs, but then I would go on a couple-hour trail ride. And in my head, I should be so strong. But when I go and ride, there's really nothing there. And it was this weird disconnect that was frustrating to me, because I had a lot of technical skill on the bike and I had a lot of general fitness. But when I actually started pedaling, I just did not feel good. And so I started trying to figure that out for myself over the next year. And then once I started racing, I realized that a lot of the top racers in the US and some in the world that I'd raced alongside with, they were struggling with this too. Like they didn't have it really figured out either. And I was like, oh gosh, there's like a real need here. And even as someone who's been at a professional level in downhill racing, and I've been a full-time trainer for years now, I'm having a hard time figuring this out. And I was like, if I'm having a hard time figuring this out, and these top athletes are too, there's something here. So I started figuring out, I'm like, okay, how do you address this? And I had known about super compensation, which is, it's essentially your recovery curve from any stimulus. And if someone types in super compensation curve on Google, they can see the arc and how a training session affects your, it would be how you essentially make gains off of training. So for example, this arc, if you had the x-axis and you're going across, and that was your time to recovery, when you did your initial training session, and let's just say the y-axis is your performance, after your initial training session, your performance would drop because you're fatigued, you need time to recover. I think we would all expect that.
Well, over the course, I was struggling so much on that climb, because I'd done my first weight strength training session like 2 days beforehand, and then I had like 2,500 meters of climbing or something stupid. Yeah,
doing your first session before a ride like that would be a recipe for disaster without a doubt. Because essentially, the next couple of days, that curve is coming back to a baseline, but it doesn't really start surpassing your initial baseline. So hopefully your body's adapting to that new stimulus, and it goes beyond that initial level of performance of that first training session. And now this is the super compensation arc on the graph where you want to hit your next training session. And this would happen 3 to 5 days, essentially post, maybe 3 to 4 days post your initial strength session. Gotcha. And so doing your next session then actually allows you to make gains. And if you look at the total, you're really training 2 days a week. And so if you miss that second session, what happens is that the curve just comes back down to your initial level of performance. So if you are only doing one strength session per week, and this is for the person listening that only trains legs once a week, because I know a lot of you guys are out there, then you're
Yeah.
you're kind of I don't know if I'd go as far as saying you're restarting every week, but your ability to make true gains
We just sort of like you're never
is
really
very limited.
progressing because you just keep going. You get the sore pain, you get the fatigue, and then you get back forward. You're not really actually moving very far.
Yeah, well, you get crazy fatigued and sore, and it's like a 4-day cycle, and then all of a sudden you're like, I don't want to do that again for a while until the next Monday or the next Tuesday, whenever you're
Yeah.
remotivated, then you hit it again, and you're
Yeah.
kind of just forever sore. Your
Okay.
body
Yeah.
never gets it consistently enough to truly adapt to it. And so that super compensation curve was one of the first things that made me realize I was like, okay, if you're actually trying to make gains in strength, the minimum has to be at least 2 days a week of training.
Okay. Yeah.
And then at the time I was working for a company called Equinox, super bougie gym. They invest a lot into their trainers' education, and it's an incredible gym to work for as a trainer. I'd recommend it to anybody, especially anybody starting out.
Yeah.
And they were big on functional movement. They had this basically 7 effective movements or 7 essential movements that when you were programming for your client, your fitness directors would actually make sure that you're including at least one of each of these per week so that it's a balanced program. And so that is a knee dominant movement, which is like a lunge or a step up, a hip dominant movement, like a squat or a deadlift, a core movement, which could be a plank or a power off press or a Russian twist, all sorts of core movements. There's a horizontal push, which is a push up or a bench press. There's a horizontal pull, which is like any rowing variation. And then there's vertical push and pull. So there's the shoulder press or a pull up or a lat pull down. If you do at least one of those each week, the chances are you're going to have a pretty balanced program. And in fact, a lot of people need a 2-to-1 ratio with posterior chain exercises opposed to anterior chain exercises. So this would be back exercises and glute and hamstring focused versus chest, shoulder, and quads. And so that's kind of general to combat people's posture who are sitting at desks, or especially bike riders who don't use those muscles as much as they do the muscles on the front side of their body when they're riding, because all your weight is on your shoulders and your chest, and you're pushing with your quads. And there's a little pull, with your hip flexor, and you use your hamstrings a little bit. But I mean, I think we could all admit that it's like even when all your muscles are working, you have these dominant muscles just because of the nature of the movement.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, we got to have at least one of those each week. We got to have a minimum of 2 sessions. If you train your legs too much, you're just going to be smoked, period. And the more you ride, even though you're more conditioned, the more you have to be careful about this. But if you do all of these movements over the course of 2 sessions, you're also not really going to have a split program, which would be a dedicated leg day, a dedicated push day, and a dedicated pull day. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it. It could be chest and back, or it could be chest, shoulders, and arms, or it could be whatever. But we're probably going to get away from that just because of the low frequency of the strength training sessions. So then you start formulating your actual workouts, and you're like, okay, I'm predominantly using free weights for a handful of reasons, but a big reason is it's accessibility. It's the time for the session. It's the fact that a lot of times using free weights uses multiple muscle groups, and it's less isolated. And again, I'm trying to do a lot in one session, and I'm not against machines at all, but that was the direction I started moving. And so I started building these workouts, and I was like, oh man, I'm doing it myself, and I'm like, this works. And I'm actually progressing. My FTP is going up. My rides feel good. I still overdo it occasionally here and there, and because I'm filming videos, my strength volume is a little bit higher than people I'd recommend. But it was weird because I started realizing, I was like, your level on the bike is almost, it's not irrelevant to the strength training program you can do, but you have to disconnect your experience and your level of performance on the bike from what you can do in the gym. Because I might give somebody who's an extreme beginner on the bike and a beginner to fitness, and maybe they're pretty deconditioned, the same strength program that I would give a world tour road athlete, not because they're not deconditioned, obviously, but because they're already doing so much and they're not doing any strength, that you want to just give them like a little dose. Like, you don't want to interfere with something that's already working. The plan is to really support it, and make it better. And so they might be doing the same program, and it's like, wow, this person's 100 pounds overweight and this person is a world level athlete, and why are they doing the same program? But that would be why. And there's all these little questions and weird things that I've experienced focusing on cyclists alone that has really caused Out Health to be what it is now. It's just like getting wildly focused on a niche of the sport. And really now it's the endurance side of cycling. So road, gravel, and cross country MTB. I still work with some gravity athletes who know my background and my history, but it gets very different with the training. So the endurance side is what I've really honed in on, and that's how Dowd Health has really come to be what it is. And when you say like, how do I balance this out? That's why I get excited, because that's what I've literally just had to figure out over the last, it's been about 8 years.
I mean, I can totally relate to that from the nutrition side for me with my athletes, and how I got with my business and working with specifically nutrition for cycling. I mean, I have triathletes and the odd runner here as well, but specifically like cycling, a lot of it has been trial and error and figuring out like, well, this isn't working the traditional approach here, but how do we optimize what people are eating in a way that is sustainable and that they can continue and maintain. And similar to you with the strength, like starting small and building up and building up and building up and building confidence and getting people to realize for themselves how or why it matters and making it work within their lifestyle. That's why it's not necessarily nutrition isn't necessarily one size fits all, but same thing with strength. Like there'll be, I'm sure, different exercises that you'd be then recommending for specific goals, whether someone's like a climber or they're a sprinter or they're a time trialist. But yeah, I think that's really cool to have learned about the development of Dialed Health and how applying it in practice is so important, and knowing that you're doing it yourself and you're seeing the benefits, but also so are the athletes that you are working with, whether they're beginners or Olympic World Tour riders.
Yeah, totally. And literally the question that you had was the reason I started this business. So that's why I, go off on this crazy rant with it. And when you said the word sustainable, by the way, that was the word I was looking for earlier.
I was wondering if that was the word that you were thinking.
Sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah, because to be honest, it's actually something I'm struggling with right now, because I just started a calorie deficit, and I'd actually be curious to hear your thoughts on this, not to like turn the tables of the podcast on you, but I have done a challenge called the Dowd Health Shred a few years in a row. 30-day fat loss challenge, food tracking. And the point of the food tracking, it's for one, education. And I have no idea what your thoughts are on how you work with your athletes, whether it's food tracking or just intuitive eating or a combination or whatever. So I'm telling you like it is. So basically food tracking really did change my life. It was very empowering for me. And I think like the way I do a lot of things, I've definitely gone too far with certain things, food tracking included. However, food tracking gave me results I was looking for a very long time, and that I had never gotten previously without changing any of my workload. And the biggest thing for me was that I was eating a wide variety of healthy foods at the time. I was just eating a lot, the amount of fat I was eating from just egg yolks and avocados and cashews. Like great, healthy, beautiful foods, but like way too much to be lean.
Yeah, for me, I talk a lot about how like it all comes down to timings, frequency, portions, and context. And there's no perfect food, and you could eat anything in excess, and it can be problematic in a certain context. I 100% agree. I've had a couple of conversations with other pro riders who have talked about tracking being empowering for them. I think for me, I could talk about it being a tool, like a tool, not a rule.
Yeah,
it's there to support you, and for me, it's about understanding what's going on and learning about food and getting curious. But also I find having the tracking periodically to see what's going on, what's happening here. But the big thing for me, it comes down to timing. For me, the numbers are the last thing that I'm looking at. For me, it's more the timing around the training. And that's the biggest gain. So I love to talk about it, how we've got everyday nutrition, which is what everybody needs just to stay alive and healthy and functioning. And that's where it's the quality and macronutrients, breakfast, lunch, dinner, a snack or two. And then training nutrition goes on top of that. And then if you're racing, then the race nutrition is kind of like a third bubble that we then test and experiment and figure out in training what works for you. And that's where I find the meal plan approach doesn't work, because everyone's different. Everyone's got different preferences. Some people like real food. Some people like gels. Some people like have different tolerances to personal preferences. Start with where you're at, and then look for where you're struggling, and then optimize the timing around training and build that up over a period of weeks. And for most people, I find within a 3-month period, we can figure that out in a way that then they're free. Like, off you go and figure it out. You've kind of got your baseline structure of the timing around the training that you need, that you then go and continue that journey of practicing, experimenting, and like you say about the eating too much. I've seen a lot of, I had one guy, I helped him lose 6 kilos in a month. And the only thing we changed was I got him eating vegetables. And so, like, it sounds like, oh, that's so simple, it's too boring. Like, well, the thing is, there wasn't enough substance in his meals. So the portions would double at every meal. And you're hungry. Like, if you're training 15, 20, 30 hours a week, you're hungry.
Yeah.
Like, and that's what I see people usually in that catch back calorie sort of headspace of like, oh, I can eat whatever I want and I'll lose weight. I'm like, only really kind of works if you're doing like 25, 30 hours of training a week. And then the second that training stops, it all falls apart and it keeps you stuck and trapped in having to keep exercising. Whereas what I found is that when people start learning this approach of fueling around the training, different days have different needs. And that might be, okay, you might have 5,000 calories on this day, and then 2,000, and then 2.5, and then 3,000 and 5,000. But the difference is that extra food is like coming in before, during, and after training in a way that it maintains long term. So
oh my gosh,
yeah,
I love this.
So,
I have to get you on my podcast to dive into this. And it's funny, as you're talking about the timing.
Yeah,
I have tracked all my food on a day where I've done a 100-mile ride, because I was like, you know what?
Yeah.
You know, I feel like I can still out eat any ride that I do, almost any ride. So when I did the double Everest, I burned 20,000 calories, almost 20,000. And I did not outdo that.
Yeah, because you physically can't. You feel like it's almost physically impossible to, unless you're eating, you'd have to be eating a lot of fat from carbs. Like, you'd have to be getting a ton of that energy coming from fats to be able to eat it during the ride.
Well, and I've learned too, just through tracking and paying attention to just how I feel during rides and total calorie count and all that if I eat too much fat, I get really burpy, and I just burp a lot, and my stomach is constantly like, it's just like a little bloated. And I mean, I did eat a lot of fat and drank an insane amount of caffeine during that 24 hours, but I can't always out eat a big ride. But there was a day I did a 100-mile ride, and I tracked everything. I tracked all the food I ate on the ride. I still, and I was like kind of on a mission, because I used to binge eat a little bit. And so when I started doing big rides, I went from binge eating for no reason to saving the binge for the post big ride. And so, because it was kind of like the ride to eat sort of mentality. And so then I tracked one day, and it was around 5,000 calories for the total day. And I spilled over just a little bit, and I ate gross. And I ate gross. It was a proper binge. But I remember thinking, I was like, oh, if I wasn't tracking, I would have probably even had more food. And that's when I knew, I was like, whoa, this is like a big gut check for me. I can't just go out ride anything I eat. You know, you really can't, like, I'm sure you've heard this before, you can't outride a bad diet. And so
100%. Like, that's what I see in practice is people have got to be training like 20, 30 hours a week in order to lose weight by exercising, because you do the endurance exercise, your appetite goes through the roof. And then when I'm looking at a food diary, it's like, the numbers are part of it, but I get people to record and write down like all the food rules. They have like the context of what's happening and write it down, because it might be of like, oh, I've earned it, or it's like, oh, like, or eating something that I bought it, so I have to finish it, or I've got to finish my plate, even if you don't like it or you're satisfied and stuff. Like, all these little food rules which can be sabotaging us and rewiring them. And sometimes the problem, like, I'm addicted to sugar. I can't stop snacking. I'm addicted to sugar. I'm like, often that's just a symptom of not having fueled enough in training, not enough fueled enough before, during, and after. And there's so many things that I've changed in my practice. I mean, I did my doctorate. The reason I did my doctorate, the questions I was trying to answer, why are people so anti-fueling in training and racing when it's like the best performance enhancer ever? And a lot of it came down to us in my research was fear of gaining weight. So people weren't fueling in training and racing because they're like, oh, it's going to make me gain weight. Oh, I don't really need it. I can get away with it. And my challenge is always like, are you really getting away with it? Or are the problems that you're experiencing the outcome and the consequence of having not fueled adequately? And yeah, the stuff that I get people telling me all the time, they're like, oh, this was a game changer. It's simple little changes, but it's just little tweaks that have a big impact long term. And it's the mental challenge of actually doing it is the hardest thing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of times I hear people say, oh, I only rode for an hour and a half, I don't need to fuel. And I'm like, well,
yeah,
I don't need to do a lot of things,
yeah,
but
like,
I do things because it's better.
Yeah,
because
just because you can doesn't mean you should or shouldn't.
Yeah, totally well said. It's like, okay, well, you can get by. Like, I could also get by without water for the next 3 days. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I don't technically need it. So it's, you have to think there's a point where I know that's pretty extreme, but at the same time, if you're not going to fuel on a 90-minute ride, it's like, what would have the outcome been if you did, or did just a little bit,
like,
or found that boundary?
Like, what is the cost?
Yeah.
And is it worth the cost? And again, that's a big change in my practice that I made actually from COVID, because obviously everyone went from being able to train outside to being training inside. And what I saw with my Training Peaks, because I've got a Training Peaks account as a coach, I'm always looking at food diaries and training, because like people are like, oh, what should I eat? I'm like, well, it depends on your training. Like, if I don't know what you're training, like, I can't really help you. And it's just a bit like, well, maybe this could work. Maybe like, I'm just guessing. Whereas I know what your training looks like, then we can be specific about like, all right, aim for this, whatever. But what I saw in COVID is, because typical the traditional advice is like, if it's less than an hour and a half, you don't need to fuel. You can get away with it. Like, oh, your body's got all the stores. I'm like, yeah, in theory it does, but what's the cost? What's the aftermath? Like, oh, I'm really tired, I'm really hungry, I'm nibbly and stuff. Whereas you add a little bit of fuel in there and that calms down, and you can just go on with your merry way the rest of the day. And in COVID, I was seeing people doing Zwift training and Zwift races bonking on the warm-up, then having nothing left for the actual race, and running out of energy and running out of fuel in these sessions that they didn't need it. And I was seeing their energy expenditure go up sometimes by like 300 calories per session. So say a standard session burns about 500 calories, burning at 800 calories in the same session, which is why they're running out of fuel, running out of energy. And so that was probably the biggest change I made to my practice, was getting people to fuel all of those sessions, even the easier ones, at a lower level, using more like foods that have maybe more fats or a little bit less carbs. But I found that just making this little change, they had better quality training, they didn't bonk as much, and then the rest of the day they were able to make smart food choices, which is where the deficit happens. Because there's almost always a deficit in training. It's just that how can you maintain it the rest of the day? And if you've got like 50 calories here, 50 here, 50 here, 50 here, lots of tiny that you like insignificant in isolation, but you add them all up and it can make a big deficit that you're not even really conscious of. And that's how it becomes that sustainable, maintaining it long term, versus, okay, cool, I've lost my weight for the challenge, and then I just go back to my old eating habits and rebound and gain it back all again.
Okay, so this is where I feel a little convicted about how I've operated my shred. So for one, there's been insane results, myself included. This is the protocol I've used. There's also, I have seen rebounds though, and that kind of eats at me, because it's like, okay, obviously someone's choices are outside of my control. But from a coaching perspective, it's like you should be, you should know certain problems before they arise for people, and, try and coach someone so that they don't go through that. Now, the thing about the shred is actually not the food tracking. The whole idea of tracking is so that you can eat close enough to a baseline to not be underfueled and to still be in a deficit. Because you're going to feel hungry at some point in a shred. Yeah. I hate when people say you don't have to. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts on this, but like I've talked to nutritionists, they're like, why do you feel hungry? And I'm like, cause I'm in a, I'm in a 300 calorie deficit for a week. Yeah.
Yeah. I worked in boxing before I started working in cycling, and I brought a lot of the philosophies we used in boxing. If you don't make weight, you don't fight. And
Yeah.
and like it, part of the process, if you're trying to get the leanest version of yourself, and this is where I'm always talking to people about, like, leanness doesn't always equate being the fastest, because I've also seen people lose that 2 kilos and lose 100 watts in the process because they didn't
Wow.
lose fat, they lost muscle. There's multiple factors going on, but it's possible to get leaner. It just takes a lot of mental headspace and a lot of time and effort, and you've got to have the right environment around you. And I like to talk to people about, like, with you kind of got your walk around weight that might, like, a version of you that you're happy with, that you don't really need to think about and is sustainable. And your race weight might be 1 or 2 kilos lower, but if it's like 5-10 kilos lower, then it's not going to be sustainable. Like 1 or 2 kilos, like, you want to be in a position where you can be just walking around all year round and it's sort of stable, plus or minus a kilo. But then you've got a
Mm-hmm.
key race. Then in the 6, 8, 12 weeks beforehand, you're like, okay, cool, I've got time, I've got capacity, I can put my head down, I can really just tighten things up to lean it out. But as you say, you're going to get hungry in that process, and you've got to be able to suck it up and part and be able to cope with that hunger and recognize this is part of this is the cost of getting this lean. Is it worth the
Mm-hmm.
cost? Is it actually giving me the outcome that I need and I want?
There's actually a great podcast. It's one of my favorites. I'm about to re-listen to it because I just started being in a calorie deficit, but it's by Jeremy Scott. He's a general fitness guy from the US, and it's called The Cost of Being Lean. And he literally goes through, I think, every body fat percentage. He groups them by like 3% or 4%. And he's like, okay, this is what this body fat percentage looks like lifestyle wise. And here's how you'll
Yeah.
look, maybe how you'll feel. And he goes through each one all the way down to like bodybuilder show ready, 5-6%
Yeah.
for men. And
And they're
gets down in
miserable.
the,
They're miserable.
it,
They're so
but
unhappy. You're
the
eating
way he
alone. You're
talks about
miserable.
it is so real. He's like, in the title of it, it is the cost of being lean.
Yeah.
And so what's funny is that when you do a program, especially to the masses, and I'm sure you've experienced this a lot, and it's probably the reason you're a coach and you work with people one-on-one, is because you
Yeah.
know that you have to have very hard boundaries for enough clarity to get through to people to be successful. So like
Yeah.
Dialed Health Shred, you food track for 30 days. You eat in a caloric deficit, 300 to 500 calories. Maybe you eat back up to maintenance if you need it. But the whole point is you fuel your riding and you have your baseline, like you had mentioned, that's like a similar philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And really, your calories are dictated in your carbs by the amount of volume you do on the bike or the intensity.
Yeah.
Protein has a minimum, and then your carbs and your fat kind of fluctuate with your expenditure. So
Yeah.
that's kind of, in a nutshell, sort of how I do it. But the thing is, it is a hard line. It
Yeah.
is, if you can't track it, you don't eat it. If you, which is a very wide variety of foods. Like I've always felt confident saying that because I'm like, okay, if the
Yeah.
only foods you can't eat are foods you can't track, I'm sorry that you can't go to that one taco truck you like to go to on the weekend, but that's the cost of being lean. It's like, okay, you could eat it so many other things, but it's the sustainability thing that is like getting at me. And I know that there's a
Yeah.
better way. And I was just talking to a past winner of the shred who it honestly changed his life as well. He lost 60 pounds. He had a heart attack scare. It was like this crazy thing. Used the shred to get crazy lean. Now he's winning age groups at big gravel races like SBT.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really sick. And he is starting his shred November 1st, and he's doing it November to January because in January he wants to really up his riding volume
Yeah.
and focus on just fueling. And I was like, okay, I like this
Yeah.
because when you're in a deficit, what I've experienced is like, I'm not bonking in rides because I'm feeling the ride, but I'm reaching for calories way earlier in rides. Like,
Yeah.
and I sip on calories at the start of my ride or carbs initially.
Yeah.
Now that's like a rule. But before I did that, it's like 15 minutes in, I'm already grabbing the gel kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So anyways, that's kind of like, I digress, but he was like, okay, do a shred, extend it 2 months so it's more sustainable, and include the holidays, which you have to navigate without tracking and enjoying, obviously. And it just, what it does, it's this longer time frame which I believe could lead to more sustainable habits. And it's not this switch on and off where it's like, okay, I'm perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm back to what I was doing.
Yeah.
And it helps you learn that process. But it's also, you get to this point where you're like, okay, now there's fuzzy boundaries. And now this gets difficult to be successful when you're not going to be one-on-one coaching people through the process. So, but then again, it's like, I know the 30-day boundary on what I'm doing up to this point, it doesn't feel like the best way anymore, which is kind of weird to say. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, if I were to host it's a fat loss challenge for cyclists. I know some people, diet's very triggering. Obviously, just saying the word diet, fat loss, focus. I am trying to lose fat freaks people out, but it's what it is.
Yeah, I find from a performance perspective, you do need about 12 weeks. I find if you want to do it without it really potentially compromising the performance perspective. I've had guys who's going to be racing at Kona next weekend. I was working with him this time last year, and we got 6 kilos off him, and his power went up by like 35 watts at the end of sort of distance training, and all by fueling the training, prioritizing everything around her, and getting more food and quality and volume into everything else. So that's what, for me, I find that it doesn't have to be this extreme hunger. It's looking at what's in those other foods. I'm always looking a little bit more than just if it meets your macros. For me, it's more okay, well, yes, you could have the rice and chicken and broccoli, carrot, standard bodybuilder sort of meal. It's not that filling. Or you could have something that is like triple the volume, but because of the vegetable content, the fiber is keeping you fuller and it's more satisfying, and you're less likely to be hungry. But that's where it's about changing choices and behaviors as well. So I find I think a month, 30 days is a good sort of starting point. But it's also then how realistic are people's goals and how realistic are the changes. With the framework and the approach that I use with people, the first week, I don't really like people changing anything because I find people change it anyway. If you start changing things from day 0, then it ends up being so different to what your norm is. And that's where it's like kind of that whole New Year's resolution. People go like, okay, I'm going to go veganuary, go vegan for January. And by the end of the month, like they might last a month, but then they're like, okay, cool. They just go flip the switch and just go back to their normal eating habits. Whereas if you start with what you're currently doing, you can then account for changes in life, work, stress, holidays, all those things, and account for those along the way by making changes that stick with what you're currently doing. So I think a month, it's for sustainability, it starts to sort of fall apart a little bit. I find it's 6 weeks. I find by like when I'm working with people one-on-one, it's usually every 2 weeks I see with them for a 3-month sort of period. And I find by about 6 weeks, that's when they're starting to like, okay, cool, I've got this down pat, I figured this out. And then by 6 weeks, we start weaning off the tracking and not using the tracking so much, because then they're more aware of like, that's what 50 grams of carbs is, that's what 100 grams of carbs is, and they're able to guesstimate it by sight in meal, and then know, all right, well, cool, I'm eating it at home, I'm eating on holidays, I'm eating at the restaurant, I'm eating at the hotel, wherever. I know roughly what that looks like, which makes it the sustainability piece for everyday living. Whereas when you're looking at the like really fine tuning it for like the race, or for that key one race we want to get like really specific, you kind of need to have that baseline fight camp. I brought this a lot of it from weight making in boxing, and the traditional ways, like they're living off diets of biscuits, and like they're not really eating anything. They're like, I don't understand why. I'm like, yeah, but everything you're eating is super high energy, lots of fat, has lots of sugar in it. So you eat a packet of biscuits and that's your whole energy. That's your whole energy capacity for the day. Whereas you could eat 3 times as much volume of food by looking at the quality of it and get more protein and feel fuller, feel more satisfied from those meals, and still have a deficit. And that's where it comes into the quality of food as well. Certainly the 30-day challenges are helpful as a starting point, but I find it's not usually enough to see like the progress that's sustainable. Like I find usually it might take, especially women, it might take people 2 weeks of being consistent with a change before they start seeing progress on the scale. And I don't know why this is, but we feel this change, we can see it and we can feel it, but then you get on the scale and the scale says nothing's changed, and then people get
Yeah.
demotivated, like, oh, it didn't work, it didn't, like, whereas, yeah, with women, you need more time again for it to really tune in and to really start kicking in, and progress that you can actually record or measure or compare.
Yeah, and that's why I'm a huge proponent or a promoter of photos, like before and after photos, weekly
Yeah.
photos. Because again, it sometimes you need to look at it back and compare, because you just
Oh,
forget as time goes
100%.
on.
100%. Because we
So
can see
that can be
ourselves,
a
but
really rewarding thing.
other people can see us. And yeah, it's interesting one, because for me, like as a dietitian, I'm registered in Australia and we're not allowed to use testimonials. And part of that is like things like before, the things you would standard use to promote your business and promote like how you
Yeah,
promote
you're not
people.
allowed to use
We're
testimonials.
not allowed to use them. And so it makes it very challenging
What?
to, yeah, it's part of the health, allied health limitations. So yeah,
Wow.
there's a lot of things that you would like to use and to do, but we're not allowed to do it, and it makes it really challenging because yeah, you like,
Is
okay,
that just like photo testimonials or written
written
testimonials?
testimonials as well. It's this really gray, weird area. Whereas other countries,
Whoa.
it's not a problem. So yeah, you sort of end up having to use more. Yeah, it's a very interesting way to, you're talking about things, or this has happened, but you're not necessarily able to, like, here's this person, look at them before, look at them after, and yeah, it's very
Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah. Wow, that's challenging. I did not
Yeah,
know that was a law anywhere. Wow.
yeah, yeah, but yeah, because that would be, from a promotion sort of perspective, that's the stuff that I find from nutrition, and as obviously as a dietitian as well, then you want to be coming from an evidence base, and it tends to come, people like, oh, that's too boring, that's too simple, but a lot of time we aren't doing the simple stuff, and that actually has big impact. So like I said about the vegetables, people are like, oh, it can't be that simple. I encourage people to try and eat like a kilo of vegetables a day. I'm like, oh, that's impossible. I'm like, well, not really. Like if you think, and it comes down to the general healthy population recommendations of
Mm-hmm.
two fruits, 5 vegetables a day. Like a piece of fruit or 250 grams. That's 500 grams. You have fruit, some veggies in your lunch, veggies in your dinner. It's actually quite easy to achieve that, but it displaces energy and volume that helps compensate from the hunger perspective. So it's like hunger is always going to be part of it, but it's then working it, the timing around in a way that it's not eating you alive and making it not just like consuming every ounce of your thoughts every second of the day.
Yeah, because if you're hungry, it's a 24. I mean, that's the thing about
Mm,
making changes with your diet. It is a 24/7 endeavor. It's
yeah,
like you almost can never hide from it, if you, especially if you're hungry, or if you're doing a
yeah,
process that is not enjoyable or like not
yeah,
sustainable, I guess. It's 24/7. It's not like you go do a hard workout and then you leave, or you go do your job that you
yeah,
don't like and you leave. It is like you are in it. So
yeah.
no, I
And this is
appreciate
also
the
like
feedback
being,
on that.
you got to have, and I think also then you got to be really clear on your why, and like
Yeah.
why is it important to you, and what are you making it mean? Because yeah, typically like the standard piece thing people come to me is like, I want to lose 5 kilos and to be faster, and that assumption being leaner makes you faster. And I've been trying to get Jonas Abramson on my podcast the last 2 years. We just keep not being able to coordinate times, because he was always trying to race at 60 kilos and now he races at 80 kilos and he's like smashing it at Tour de France, and his skin folds are identical at 80 kilos as they were at 60. So he hasn't, people assume that, oh, if you gained weight then that's a bad thing, but actually his power has just like skyrocketed. And I've seen that a lot as well. It's more, for me, it's more the body composition and working with the person. The leanest version of them isn't always the healthiest or the strongest or the most powerful. And for me, it's finding, okay, with each person, where's that, as you say, like the walk around weight that you can kind of live in easily without having to really think about it. And then when you got that key race or two, we intentionally like, okay, tighten things up just for that period of time, and then we'll work our way back out of it. And when it's less extreme, So I like it to be like ideally about 1-2 kilos. When it's only about 1 or 2 kilos, you can extrapolate a couple of weeks back and make these tiny little, don't even notice it, changes that when you give it time, you get to that point, you're like, oh, that felt really easy, versus like, okay, I've got to lose 2 kilos this week, and feeling just it's just consuming you. But
Yeah.
that's where it's a bit of a mind. There's a lot of mindset, behavior, psychology, food stuff going in, which I find the longer I work as a dietitian, the more I'm learning and utilizing training in behavior change techniques as well, because I find that it's not just the food, it's like all the things that are going on around that are affecting the food. And when we sort of support those, it helps better food choices be made along the way.
Yeah, that is definitely something that I think a real coach comes to learn after a while. And you have to constantly master that craft. And
Yeah.
it actually influences a lot of the way that I deliver content, because you never want to make compromises uh, to what you think is ideal, but you do have to meet people where they're at sometimes. And
Oh, for sure.
and I think what's tough is that, you know, what I initially saw as, you know, making compromises to what I thought was the best training program ever. In reality, what I would do, and I'm sure it's the same way with your coaching business through nutrition, it's like, you know what would probably be perfect, and you've experienced it, and you've worked with people on it, but then you have this person that is so far from that, that giving them that is actually not even realistic. So like, you would not even
Yeah.
be helping somebody if you
Yeah.
gave them like what the quote unquote perfect thing is. It
Yeah.
really, you know, in your case, I'm sure you told someone, just don't drink 3 sodas today, you know, like just don't do
Yeah.
that, or I don't know,
It's more.
but
I think
I,
it's more the like. Yeah, for me, it's more the eating. I mean, I work with a lot of people with eating disorders,
oh, okay.
and also I find a lot of people are under fueling and under eating, which is actually creating a lot of problems that they're experiencing. And most, like, it is very rare that I'm telling people to eat less. It's usually the opposite. I'm usually getting people to eat more,
Wow.
but it's eating more at the right time and the foods that are supporting their goals. So it's a very rare occasion that I'm saying eat less of that, but it'd be more like the sodas, the Cokes or whatever. It's like, okay, let's work at how can we incorporate something that you want to consume, rather than putting on the bad list and then you crave it and you want it more and then you go and binge on it and it just spirals. It's like, all right, there's a way we can make this fit. There will be compromise, because yeah, you can't have it all the time, every day, all the time. But it's like, how can we make this fit and work in your lifestyle that is sustainable, so that you can be like, okay, cool. I'm willing to have them on these days, and I'm going to incorporate them. I'm going to really enjoy them, versus be like, oh, I'm not allowed to eat that. I'm not allowed to drink that, and the craving and the desire and the rebound urge to it just sort of catapults. And so yeah, I think this is where it's that whole starting where people are at. And like, I know, like, yeah, a lot of times people come, they're not fueling anything in training. I know they should be and could be fueling up here. And or if they've an eating disorder person, they're under fueling, like, I know they could be eating double the food intake that they've got. But to go and give them a meal plan that triples their food intake terrifies them, because they're paranoid about gaining weight. It's not going to support them.
Yeah.
And whereas making baby steps that get in isolation might look like, oh, that's not going to make any difference, but it helps to calm down the fear and the stress, and then see the difference. And because the hardest thing is actually doing it. And I've seen people where I've been like, okay, I want them to fuel 50 grams an hour in a training session that ultimately needs about 80 or 90, and it takes them, like, say it's 2 weeks before I see them again. And it was day 9 that they actually went and did it. And then they came back to me like 3 days
Yeah.
later. They're like, oh my goodness, I felt amazing. That was so different. I was like, I was like, I've only been telling you for the last like 3 weeks to try and to do this. But this is where that psychology comes in. And the stuff I love and that I'm really good at is like figuring out, okay, what makes people tick and what's worrying them, and what do they really mean when they say this, and how do we connect the goal of what I want them to do, because I know it's going to help them achieve their goals, become important for them. And that's, for me, it's with my one-on-one clients, is then working my way out of a job, interesting enough, because like,
Yeah.
I want them to learn and understand what their bodies need and what works for them, and why. And I had really great feedback from an athlete this week who was like, yeah, I just love that you don't gatekeep it. you explain it all, and you show the training peaks and why this is happening, and then why you're recommending it, so that I can go and I understand the science, but then I can go and put it into practice and get confident in it for myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, it's a funny position that you're in, almost trying to get people to graduate from your skills and knowledge and coaching. But ultimately
Yeah,
that kind of would be the goal. And then I think also what's cool is that people always need, they always need a touch base. They need
yeah.
to recalibrate.
Oh,
And
for sure.
what's funny,
Yeah,
that's kind of how I use food tracking now. It's like you do
yeah,
it for a
absolutely.
short period of time, you get to where you want to be. 6 months rolls by, you're like, okay, I need to check this in a little bit, and
Yeah,
I'm going to track for a day or 3 days. And then all of a
yeah,
sudden you're like, oh, wow, it's crazy how these things snuck back in there. I'm going to just
yeah.
recalibrate, and then I'm good for another little while. So yeah, people are always going to
Absolutely, and
need
that's
that refresher.
oh, absolutely, and that's what I sort of teach. I mean, for me, I have like a membership that's kind of like an ongoing thing where people can questions, and they may not need a one-on-one call, but they're like, oh, I've got these questions, and then I can create resources and answer those questions in real time. But the
That's cool.
um, like like you're sort of saying with the food tracking, like I talk about it being a tool, not a rule, and you'll be periods where you might be using it
Mm,
intensively, and then it might be a like, oh, what's in that food, like how, and or for me, I like using it as a way, like how can we expand what and increase rather than like restrict, because a lot of people when they're trying to diet or they're trying to cut calories and cut weight, it's like, okay, I've got to have less, like I've got to have little, and that also creates that scarcity hunger scenario. I'm like, okay, no, flip the switch. Like, what's the maximum amount? And also, how do we use foods that help you feel fuller? And like, I mean, quinoa is I remember an athlete years ago being like, can I really eat this much quinoa? I was like, yeah, because it's super high in protein and there's a huge water content. It's like, if you're only having a tablespoon, I'm like, that's not even touching the sides. Like, you need like basically like three
hmm.
quarters, of, like a third of the plate. And that's where I like using it as an educational tool to like measure out your portion sizes and be empowered by it, and so be like, okay, well, yes, I could eat 3 of these crackers, and that also that's equivalent to a cup and a half of this other food, or this
Hmm.
potato is equivalent to energy wise or carb wise to 2 of those crackers, or whatever food it is. And rather than being like, oh, I can never eat this food, it's like, all right, well, where's a time and place that it's helpful, whether it's the cookies or the chips or the ice cream or the brownies, and changing the mindset rather than being like, oh, cool, this is my binge night, and
Yeah.
flipping the switch of like, okay, yes, you might need more food on that day, but rather than be like, oh, sweet, I'm going to have 2,000 calories for dinner, and which probably makes you feel sick afterwards. Like, yeah, you're going to need a bigger dinner, but if we can make it like not quite so extreme, because and including foods that you might have, so yeah, like it might be going out like, all right, that night I'm going to go for pizza or I'm going to go for burgers, and yes, there will be a higher energy content on those days, but this is the day when I need it and it's supporting what I've done. But going with a different headspace of rather than I've earned it, it's like, actually this is, yeah, it's an
Hmm.
interesting one, because part of it is intuitive and there's an element of intuitive, but part of it is then supporting the needs that you have on that particular day and
Hmm.
being intentional with your food choices. So I think I like to talk to people about eating intentionally and enjoying foods rather than, and yeah, look, it's more than just the numbers.
Yeah. It makes me think too, we'll have to follow this up with you
Yeah,
on my podcast if that's
yeah,
possible in the
definitely. Yeah,
future, maybe through the
definitely.
holidays,
Yeah,
little
yeah.
holiday survival guide or something like that. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so if we wrap this up, do you have any final words of wisdom you want to share?
I didn't, it's funny, I didn't really think about anything before we started recording, but I think our discussion today is really just a reminder of the motto of the business. Like you had mentioned, start moving forward.
Yeah,
It's not about knowing how to really get to your end result. It's about stepping out and doing the next thing and
yeah,
letting the experience from that process guide you,
yeah,
because it's so easy to say, I'm right here right now and I want to be here. And I can see clearly, I mean, really envisioning the end goal is probably one of the first things you're going to want to do to get some type of roadmap or direction. But that space in between is where all the question marks are. And there's no person that's going to give you a road book that takes you directly there. And what's funny though is that if I asked you, what would be the thing that you could do today almost every time someone has an answer. And sometimes it doesn't even feel that related, but you almost need to check things off the list to create space and then allow that to guide you. This one thing, okay, you don't know how this is going to help move you to the end goal.
Yeah.
But check it off the list, and that process of completing it will take you to the next step. And it's literally that start moving forward mentality. It's every day waking up and being like, okay, like I'm going to make the decision to start moving forward on that next thing because it's going to bridge the gap is the only process, no matter what you're trying to be successful with. And that's why it's the motto of Dialed Health. And it's a continuous decision you'll have to make, especially when unpredicted things happen. Even like this car accident. Yeah, they will.
Hopefully not like that. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just been crazy because I've had all of these habits and philosophies and everything embedded deep within me. And I'm so grateful for that before this happened to me, because it's been my fallback. And that's why I know I'm going to pull out of it for the better. So that's pretty much it. I would just recommend everybody to start moving forward and listen to Gemma. I mean, it was great connecting with you, honestly.
Yeah, realize yourself, and I 100%
Thanks.
relate to that one. You've read the book, The One Thing. What's the one thing that you can do now that's going to help you towards your weekly, monthly, annual, 5-year, 10-year sort of goals? Not ignoring the power of those tiny little baby steps that over time help achieve long-term goals. Great to connect with you as well. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we will chat soon.
Looking forward to it.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, fuel your ride, and I will see you next time.